All right, this video is going to cover some of the things that come up in Meditation 4, called Truth and Falsity. And like I said in the video prepping this one, Descartes is going to deal with the problem of error, which is a sort of special case of the problem of evil. All right, so here's the issue. Once he's proven that God exists and has proven that God is sort of maximally perfect, because his idea of God is maximally perfect. So given the way his argument in Meditation 3 goes, the cause of his idea, which is going to be God, must have at least that much perfection. So God is fully perfect. Nothing that's fully perfect, he thinks, will deceive us. And so God would not be a deceiver. And so the evil demon worry goes away. I suppose it's still possible that God exists and an evil demon exists, but you, I suppose, have to think that God would prevent an evil demon from systematically deceiving us. So evil demon worry is gone. The dreaming worry isn't quite gone, but you can imagine a similar argument against that. If God exists and God is perfect, then God would not allow us to spend our entire life in a dream. It would not build us so that that could happen. We think it could happen, we think it could be happening, but that doesn't mean it actually can happen. Okay. And then Descartes notices that this seems to imply that he would never make any errors at all, because God wouldn't allow him to be deceived. It would suggest that the faculties God has given us should only ever lead to the truth. But Descartes knows that they don't. We make mistakes all the time. We make cognitive errors all the time. This whole book starts with Descartes stating that he is aware that he has in the past believed things that turned out to be untrue. So given that this starts in error, this whole book, he can't just sort of wave away the errors now. He has to come up with some explanation for how an all-good God, an all-powerful God, an all-knowing God could exist and still have constructed him such that he is prone to error. And he considers a traditional medieval response to the problem of evil. For a long time, people seemed to think that all you needed to do to respond to the problem of evil was say, evil isn't a thing, it's the absence of goodness. And so the idea seemed to be this, like if evil exists, then if God's the cause of everything, then God caused evil. And that was like, how could God be all good if he causes evil? And so some Middle Ages theologians said, well, what if evil isn't a thing? Then if it's not a thing, it has no cause because only things have causes. And so God didn't cause evil. It's surprising to me the extent to which people are still impressed by this line of reasoning. It's a really bad piece of reasoning. For one thing, facts can have causes or at least explanations. You can make a certain fact true, and here's a fact, right? There is a phone here in my left hand, and there's not a phone in my right hand. There is an absence of a phone in my right hand. You can have a fact about something not being there, not existing. So there can be a fact that that there's evil, or rather, as they would often say, a privation of good. And if that's a fact, you can ask for an explanation of the fact. You can ask, what caused there to be evil? What caused there to be less good than there might otherwise have been? And if you think God is the ultimate explanation of everything, then the same problem is going to arise. Another way of putting this is you could just ask, well, why didn't God make more goodness and therefore less evil? If evil is just the absence of goodness in some situation or some place or time, then why didn't God just make more goodness? Right? This claim that evil is nothing but a privation or an absence accomplishes absolutely nothing in this debate about the problem of evil. But it was for a long time thought to, and is still for some reason thought to. And that's something that's never quite been clear to me why anyone is impressed with this argument. And Descartes is actually not that impressed with it, or he might think it works in some ways, but he doesn't think it works about error. He doesn't think error is just an absence of truth, right? It's not just that we don't believe all the true things, it's that we believe things that are false, right? You have false beliefs, and you need an explanation for how it's possible that you have false beliefs if you were made by an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being who, because of their goodness, doesn't want you to be deceived, doesn't want to take part in any deception, right? Another way of thinking about this is it seems like we were made so that we would inevitably make mistakes. Why would that be? Wouldn't that count as deception? Wouldn't it count as deception on God's part if he made us knowing that we were going to have false beliefs? And Descartes' solution to this is, as I said in the previous video, a version of the free will defense. Because what he's going to say is we have two faculties that are relevant to the beliefs we have, the judgments we make. One is our faculty of judgment. Faculty of judgment. We have within us a faculty, or maybe a set of faculties, that are all related to coming to beliefs about the way the world is. And this is what Aristotle and Plato would have recognized as at least part of the function of reason. It's our rational, it's the fact that we're rational that allows us to do this. And then a separate faculty, according to Descartes, is our faculty of will. This is the part of our mind that is responsible for making decisions about what to do. And here is what Descartes says. Both our faculty of judgment and our faculty of will were given to us by God. And they are both as good as we can expect. Or they are, each of them, good enough that we have no reason to complain. They're not both quite perfect. The faculty of will is perfect, Descartes says, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. The faculty of judgment isn't quite. The faculty of judgment is, in a sense, perfect, but in a sense, not perfect. Here's what Descartes thinks. The faculty of judgment, if left on its own, when asked any question, will only give one of two answers, one of two kinds of answers. It will give the correct answer, or it will give the I don't know answer. So Descartes thinks your faculty of judgment, which is like your ability to reason logically, it is your ability to recognize certain facts. So like maybe your sensation is, or maybe the better way to say it is, it's the ability your mind has to sort of properly interpret your sensations and things like that. It's your ability to reason, it's your ability to engage in inductive and deductive reasoning. Descartes thinks, all on its own, if it had no influence from particularly the faculty of will, your faculty of judgment would never give you a wrong answer. It would be in that sense perfect. The faculty of judgment taken on its own is incapable of error. Why? Because God wouldn't give us one that was capable of error all on its own. It would either get to the correct answer or it would return a verdict of, I don't know the answer. So that whenever you're thinking about a problem, you'll either, if the faculty of judgment were all you had, you would either get the correct answer or you would realize that you don't know the answer. Meaning you would never fall into the position of thinking you knew the answer when you didn't. Again, if the faculty of judgment was left all on its own. But that's not the case. Because in addition to the faculty of judgment, which is sort of a limited perfection, right? It is such that it will never steer us wrong on its own. In addition to the faculty of judgment, though, we have the faculty of will. And the faculty of will is perfect. And by that, I mean there is no limitation on what it does. Your faculty of will gives you the power to make any choice. And to be clear, not like any choice that you can name. So like, imagine a situation. It's late at night, I'm recording videos. I could, consider my options right now. After this video is over, I could go to bed. After this video is over, I could go play a video game. I could read one of the many books that I own that I've never actually read. I could exercise a little bit. There's all sorts of things I can do. One of the things I can't do is fly to Mars. Right? It's not one of my options. Saying that I have a perfect faculty of will doesn't mean that I can do anything, because it doesn't mean I can go fly to Mars. It just means of the options that are actually available to me, right? That like my body is physically capable of doing, that are actually open at this moment. Of those options, I have the power to go with any one of them. Nothing will prevent me from doing something that I have sort of the capability to do. And to give maybe a better example of this, one that I'll come back to a little later, it's very common to think that some people are under the power of like maybe an addiction, right? Suppose you're addicted to heroin and you're sitting there and somebody offers you heroin. You have, it seems in a very straightforward way, the capability of turning down the heroin, right? All you have to do is say, no, thank you. I don't want the heroin. And so, because all that's involved in that is saying the words, I don't want the heroin. All that's involved in that is like not lifting your hand up to go take the heroin. It seems like that's within your power to do. But ordinarily, many of us think, well, it's in our power to do, but we still can't do it. And that's what Descartes' denying. Descartes' going to say, look, if it's in your power to do it, then you can make the decision to do it. Your faculty of will is completely unconstrained. So anything that it's within your capacity to do, you can actually decide to do, and your decision will be effective. It's not the case that you'll succeed at everything you try, but you will always try if you choose to try, right? So you could be setting up to like hit a golf ball, and you're like, I'd like to hit a hole-in-one. Descartes' not saying if you choose to hit a hole-in-one, you will hit a hole-in-one. He's saying that of the things that are under like your body's power, you can do any one of those. Now, what's under your body's power is to swing the golf club, right? And to swing it with the proper force to actually get the thing to move. But what's not quite under your body's control, what's under no one's body's control, is to have the complete and perfect control of the club necessary to hit a hole-in-one every time. What's not in your power is to understand like what the wind is doing and like how the humidity is affecting the ball, all that stuff. There's all sorts of things that can stop you from succeeding at something you try to do because they're actually outside your power. Even when you succeed, there's an element of luck to them. Descartes' not saying you can always have luck. What he's saying is the things that are completely under your physical control, you can always do. So Descartes' response to something like addiction is presumably going to be to deny, right, that addiction has this impact on you. And we'll get back to that in a bit because it does play a role here. Or how plausible that claim is on his part plays a role. But to understand his position, anything you can do, your will can decide to do. Well, here's one of the things you can do. You can form beliefs. And so Descartes thinks one thing your will can do is make you perform beliefs or form a belief. You can choose to believe something. It's not just about your external physical actions. Descartes thinks you can choose what happens up in your head. And so that's why your faculty of judgment is never quite left alone, because your faculty of will can override these judgments, right? If you can only get the correct answer or an I don't know answer from your faculty of judgment, nonetheless, your faculty of will can get you to a wrong answer. Because you'll believe what you want to, right? You'll have an answer you want to get rather than the answer that the evidence supports. And you see this all the time, right? People who tend to support one political party over another will somehow always end up believing the thing that helps their political party. People tend to believe the things that they need to believe in order to keep making money. Right? So like if you're making a lot of money selling some product and somebody comes to you and says, I think there's a lot of evidence that your product is actually really harmful. Those people who sell those goods always seem to end up finding a way to believe that the evidence is wrong. And so Descartes thinks sometimes, and in fact, every time you commit an error, there's some influence of your will on your decision-making process, but on your epistemic decision-making process, your decision about what to believe. And you can probably catch yourself doing this sometimes. You've probably had the experience of seeing something that, like a news story on like your feed, your Facebook, or I guess college students don't use Facebook anymore, but like Instagram or Twitter or something like that. And you see the headline and you know that if you read this headline, you're going to come across some information that will threaten your worldview. And you just happen to always like not click on those, right? If you have a favored candidate and there's some story about, they did something back in the 1980s that was problematic, you're like, well, I got other things to do, right? You know that evidence that you're skipping over is relevant to whether or not you should believe certain things about that candidate. But you don't want to give up on them, and so your will intervenes. This can happen sometimes in a way that you notice. It can also happen sometimes in a way that you just don't. Right? The idea is the one that we're all, I think, familiar with, is that we can make these sort of mistakes. We can have these sort of influences of our motivations on our reasoning. It's in fact often called motivated reasoning, without even being aware of it. And that's Descartes' account of how we make mistakes. We were given a faculty of judgment that isn't quite perfect. It's not like God's faculty of judgment. God's faculty of judgment would not have the I don't know. God's faculty of judgment would only lead to correct answers. But we have a faculty of judgment that at least perfectly avoids error all on its own. With a faculty of will that's entirely perfect, completely unconstrained, can do anything, right? That a will should be able to do. Our will, another way of thinking about it is, Descartes thinks our will is just as perfect as God's will. Not that we always make the right decisions, because, of course, we have this faulty faculty of judgment. We have a lack of power to do some things. But our will is just as free as God's will. And it's actually the interaction of these two faculties, both of which are as good as we can expect, that leads to error. Or in other words, our errors are our own fault. And the part of us that allows for error, our perfect faculty of will, is something we shouldn't regret having. Better to have a perfect faculty of will that sometimes leads us to make cognitive errors than to have no free will at all. Because that's the choice, Descartes thinks. Descartes thinks you can either have a perfectly free will or no will at all. And here I want to come back to the addict. Right? Descartes says there's no way to constrain your will. So let's go to the relevant passage. Nor can I reasonably complain that God gave me a will that extends more widely than my intellect. The will is a single unitary thing. Its nature is such, it seems, that there could be no way of taking away parts of it. Anyway, should not the great extent of my will be a cause for further thanks to him who gave it to me? Here's what Descartes, an objection Descartes is considering and then sort of brushing off. Couldn't God have made us so our will didn't have any influence on our beliefs? Couldn't we have perfect ability to choose between actions, like what our body does, but no control over what we believe? And Descartes thinks no. It's all or nothing with the will. And go back now to the example I gave of the addict. Is it really all or nothing? Because it seems like a heroin addict retains free will in lots of situations. Right? So let's say you're a heroin addict, but you're not currently feeling the need to take any heroin. And also you're not currently under the influence of heroin. Right? You're still an addict because you still lack the ability to resist the heroin when you are feeling the need. But you're right now unimpaired. And someone asks you, what do you want to do tonight? And you're like, I think I'd like to go out to dinner. Seems like you could make that decision freely. Seems like you could be free in most areas of your life. It's just that the areas of your life where heroin gets involved, you're not. Seems like there can be, in other words, constraints upon your will, but limited constraints. They don't take away your ability to will freely entirely. They take it away partly. The analog of this issue for the wider problem of evil is Some people have suggested, well, couldn't God have limited our free will so we can never choose to do the wrong thing, but we can freely choose between doing the right things, the morally right things? And people tend to want to make the kind of argument Descartes is making here, that you can't restrict the will that way, but it seems like you can. It seems like we do it to ourselves all the time. It seems like we put ourselves in a situation where we lose free will in certain cases. Now, Descartes would say, no, that's not what happens, because even the addict has free will. And this gets into a very tricky issue, for which, if you want to follow it up, you could take another philosophy class about it, or a philosophy class about it. Okay, so Descartes thinks you have this perfectly free will, one that can sometimes cause you to form beliefs that you otherwise wouldn't. And he says, well, it's all or nothing. We can't have a kind of will that doesn't also impact what we believe. But plenty of people think, yeah, don't we kind of have that? Because don't we lack the ability to just believe anything we want? So suppose that someone came to you tomorrow and they had a briefcase full of money and they said, I'll pay you $1 million if you make yourself believe that the earth is flat. Now, I'm trusting that all of you are rational, reasonable, and informed enough to know that the earth is not flat. If you think the earth is flat, stop. Because that's ridiculous, and people will discriminate against you for it if you tell them that belief, and worse yet, they'll be right to do so. Suppose they come to you and say, I will give you $1 million if you form the belief that the earth is flat. And you really want that $1 million. Could you do it? Do you think you could make yourself believe that the earth is flat? And really believe, not just say, right? Like, it's easy enough to say the earth is flat. Like, I'd say pretty much anything for $1 million, right? I'd go out there, just a little bit of background in case you couldn't tell already. I don't care for the president. I don't care for President Trump, who's president at the time I record this. I think he's terrible all sorts of ways, but if you give me $1 million, I'd definitely go out there and say he's the best, right? I'd wear a MAGA hat for like 10 grand all the time. Not a big deal. But it's not just pretending that this guy wants. He wants you to genuinely believe it. And he wants you to believe it by this afternoon. Right? Or make it a little more clear. He wants you to believe it in the next 10 minutes. Because there is a way you could probably do this. You could sort of, you could set yourself up, hook yourself up to some kind of electrical machine that like shocks you every time you hook up electrodes to your brain and stuff like that could measure whether in response to the question, is the earth flat, you're telling the truth. And every time you say the earth is not flat, you get a shock. You could probably like condition yourself into actually believing it. But that would take time. Probably take technology we don't have, but whatever. Now, this guy wants you to do it. He wants you to just decide to believe the same way that if someone paid me $1 million to put this hand sanitizer in one of my eyes, I could do it in like 5 seconds. And I probably would. This like probably wouldn't blind you, right? Don't do that, by the way. Don't put hand sanitizer in your eyes. No one's paying you to do that. I think, well, a lot of people think, you're not going to get that $1 million. There's no way to just decide to believe that the earth is flat. You can't consciously do this. You can't consciously just decide to believe things. That is a good point, but it's not going to quite upset Descartes' theory, because it doesn't seem like it's required that your decisions, that the way your will affects your decisions is always like, well, I want to believe this, so I'll just believe it. It seems like your will could enter into it the ways I described before, avoiding evidence you don't like, right? Working really hard to counter evidence that you do come across that you don't like. Your will can affect how you spend your sort of epistemic energy, how you spend the time that you allot for figuring out what you believe about the world. There's all sorts of ways your will can impact what you believe, without having to do the thing that does seem like implausible, which is you're like, well, I really, really want to believe that Pluto's a planet. So I'm just going to do it, right? Go for it. YOLO. That's not how the human mind works, right? But there are all sorts of ways that, even conscious ways, that your faculty of will can impact what you end up believing. There's all sorts of ways your will can interfere with the proper functioning of your faculty of judgment without having to make these conscious decisions about particular beliefs. So this is Descartes' theory of how error is possible. It's a way of reconciling his belief in God, which is going to save him from skepticism, with his awareness that he makes all sorts of mistakes. I will point out, although I won't go into it in any depth because we're running long on this video already, there is this ever-present issue with the free will response to the problem of evil that, as far as I know, there is no good response to. And the analog for Descartes is, well, why couldn't God have just given us both a perfect faculty of judgment and a perfect faculty of will? Descartes' answer is that this would have been to make us basically just like God, at least mentally. And he's just like, well, it's perfectly fine that God doesn't do that. You might wonder, like, well, why? Right? For the problem of evil, more generally, the way I usually like to put this worry is, or this criticism is, all right, suppose we've got free will, so we can decide to do bad things to each other. Why couldn't God have just made us tougher, right? Why couldn't God have just made us all like Thor from the Marvel movies? So even if someone decides to hurt me, they really can't. I mean, I guess Thor's sister hurt him, but she was more powerful than him. Why couldn't God have just made us all like physically invulnerable so that no other human being's decisions could actually lead us to be seriously injured or killed? The analog of that for the Descartes is like, why not just pump up the faculty of judgment so that you always know what the correct answer is, and that always and that prevents you from having your faculty of will sort of take over. Because what Descartes thinks is, what happens is that when your faculty of judgment gives you the I don't know answer, that's when your faculty of will is particularly powerful. And this is actually some of the evidence that Descartes' not thinking about this as your faculty of will you can just decide to believe things that you know to be false. It seems like once your faculty of judgment gets the correct answer, your will's not going to do much. It's when your faculty of will is like, well, I just don't know. You can make yourself think you know the answer that you want to be true. But why not just make your faculty of judgment more powerful, right? Why make us so limited? Descartes doesn't engage seriously with this question. He thinks there's a clear and obvious answer. I don't think there is a clear and obvious answer. Maybe there's a good answer. Lots of sophisticated theologians have spent a lot of time working on an answer to that kind of question. But we're not going to pursue it any further here. It's just something to be aware of.